It came quietly, as dangerous things often do, not with thunder or alarms, but nestled inside the folds of the Times like it belonged there. A pale envelope, smooth and unmarked, slipped between 2 pages of political commentary. Miss Marple found it while setting her tea tray beside her morning chair. Her fingers, steady despite age, turned it over. No stamp, no seal, no handwriting. And yet, the paper whispered of purpose. She held it to the light. A faint impression lay beneath the surface, not ink, but pressure, as though someone had written and then erased the words. Still, the ghost of the message remained, visible only in angled light. Some truths are better buried, but this one burns. She read the line twice, then once more. Her expression didn't change, but the rhythm of her knitting paused. Later that same afternoon, the telephone rang, a rare event in her small cottage. The voice on the other end belonged to Lady Evelyn Hawthorne, wife of the late Sir Bernard Hawthorne, matriarch of Hawthorne Hall, a house once grand, now quiet, heavy with history. "Miss Marple," the voice said, brittle and thin like aged glass. "We've had a situation here. Perhaps you'd care to visit. Tomorrow at 3. No explanation, just an invitation delivered with the kind of tone that suggested the matter was both urgent and shameful. Miss Marple didn't ask for details. She merely said, "Of course, Lady Hawthorne. I'll bring scones." That evening, the village sat in its usual stillness, save for the way the air pressed against the windows, dense, watchful. Miss Marple sat by her fire, her scarf half finished in her lap, her thoughts miles from wool and tea. She remembered the last time she'd been to Hawthorne Hall. A christening. The boy had cried. The mother now gone. The father, stern and stiff as his collar. That was years ago. Now, there was talk of a portrait burned in the library, of a solicitor who died too suddenly, of a family gathering not for celebration, but for a will that could no longer be found, and now a letter without ink. Miss Marple looked out the window toward the hills that led to Hawthorne Hall. The fog had begun to roll in, covering the land like a secret waiting to be told. She set her tea aside and began to wind her yarn into a tighter ball. Whatever had been buried at the hall had begun to burn its way back to the surface. The gravel crunched softly beneath Miss Marple's boots as she stepped out of the taxi and approached the ivy-laced gate of Hawthorne Hall. The house loomed ahead, not broken, but not proud either. Its windows stared like tired eyes, and the chimney released no smoke. A home, yes, but one that had forgotten how to breathe. She was greeted not by staff, but by Robert Hawthorne himself, the heir, the grieving son, the man who had inherited both the land and its silence. He opened the door with a forced smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Miss Marple," he said, voice tight, "thank you for coming." "Of course," she replied gently. "I always find it's better to listen before the walls forget how to speak." He didn't ask what she meant. She was led through the hall into the library, and even before she crossed the threshold, she felt it. Not a presence, but an absence. The kind that leaves its mark by what no longer stands. The portrait was gone. Above the fireplace, only soot and ghost lines remained. The frame had been reduced to blackened splinters. The once proud oil painting of Sir Bernard Hawthorne, Robert's father, had gone up in flames 3 nights prior. "I came down for a book," Robert said from behind her. There was smoke, and then the fire brigade. No one knows how it started. Miss Marple looked around. The fire hadn't spread far, only the portrait, the shelf beneath it, and the rug had been scorched. Too contained for an accident, but not a word of accusation crossed her lips. "Odd," she murmured. "How fire always seems to know where the secret lies." Robert said nothing. His eyes flicked toward the window. Then came a sharp voice from the hallway. Mrs. Camilla Hawthorne, Robert's wife, immaculate, smiling, and wound tight as piano wire. "We've been told the will was in his study," she said briskly, offering Miss Marple a handshake that felt more like a warning than a greeting. "But it's not there. The solicitor, Mr. Elwood, insisted it had been signed, that it existed. But now he's dead," Miss Marple finished quietly. Camilla blinked, then stiffened. "Yes." Miss Marple turned to the far corner of the room. The maid stood there, young, pale, her hands twisting the hem of her apron. She avoided everyone's gaze. "The solicitor died of a heart attack," Robert said quickly. "Completely unexpected." "And did he happen to speak with anyone before it happened?" Miss Marple asked softly. There was a pause. "No," Camilla said. "Too fast." Miss Marple didn't press further. Instead, she stepped toward the hearth and crouched slightly. Her gloved fingers hovered above the ashes. Beneath the charred fragments of frame, something glinted, just briefly, before she tucked it gently into her handkerchief. A small, half-melted gold cufflink. No initials, just the faint hint of a design scratched into its side. Unremarkable to most, but Miss Marple knew what to look for. She stood and faced them both. "When a portrait burns alone," she said, "it's rarely because the canvas was the problem. It's usually what's hidden behind it that makes someone light the match." Again, no one replied, but Robert's left hand unconsciously went to his wrist, where his shirt cuff lay bare. His face, however, remained expressionless. Miss Marple tucked the handkerchief into her coat pocket. Later, as she was shown to her guest room by the nervous maid, she paused in the corridor outside. A long line of portraits stared down from the walls, Hawthorne men and women, painted to be remembered. But one frame space, the one that had held Sir Bernard, now stood blank. And as the wind tapped faintly at the window panes, Miss Marple thought quietly to herself, when the face of a family is burned away, it's not history that's destroyed. It's the lie that tried to survive too long. She unpacked her knitting, sat by the window, and waited for the house to speak again. The morning broke without ceremony. A pale, watery sun slid between the clouds, casting Hawthorne Hall in a kind of light that revealed nothing and softened everything. Miss Marple rose early, as always, her hands folding her shawl with quiet purpose before descending the stairs with the grace of someone who had never needed to hurry to be heard. Downstairs, the house was too quiet. Silence lingered not as rest, but as tension stretched thin. She made her way to the breakfast room, where the maid, Edith, laid out toast with hands too pale and eyes that shifted like a sparrow's. "Have you ever seen a fire take just one thing, Edith?" Miss Marple asked gently, her eyes fixed not on the girl, but on the trembling saucer in her hand. "No, ma'am," Edith said after a moment. "Fire doesn't choose. It consumes." Miss Marple nodded. "Unless someone tells it where to begin." Edith froze. Then, without answering, turned and left. But her silence was its own reply. A knock came at the door just past 9. Inspector Alton, tall and soft-spoken with eyes too tired for his age, stood on the threshold. He was not from the village. Scotland Yard had been called in after Mr. Elwood's death raised questions no one local dared to answer. "We've had a report," he said quietly to Miss Marple, who met him in the hall. The solicitor's office was cleared out the day after his death. No will, no records, not even the client index card. "Efficient," Miss Marple said, "or desperate." They walked together to the library. She showed him the cufflink, wrapped in the linen she had hidden the night before. "One of a pair," she said, "left behind in ashes that should have been only wood and canvas, and a very specific pattern engraved, 3 crossed feathers, part of the Hawthorne crest." Inspector Alton examined it, then looked toward the empty space above the hearth. "Whoever set the fire," he said slowly, "knew exactly what they were looking for. Or what they needed to destroy," Miss Marple added, and knew time was running out. Robert Hawthorne entered the room then, his face composed but gray beneath the surface. Behind him, Camilla, perfect posture, cold expression, as though any warmth might crack the porcelain finish of her composure. "You're making accusations," she said to the inspector, her voice sharp. "In our home." "No accusations," Miss Marple said gently. "Only observation, and perhaps the question or two." She opened her notebook and placed a small folded paper between its pages, a letter she'd been given that morning by Hester, the vicar's wife. "It was handed in at the vicarage post," she explained. "No name, no return address, but it's dated the day before the fire, and it says only this: he found the truth. He must not speak it." Robert moved then, just slightly. Not toward her, but away from the table. A man in retreat, measured and subtle. Camilla's expression did not shift, but her fingers moved, barely, clutching at the pearl necklace she wore like armor. Inspector Alton leaned forward. "Who's he?" Miss Marple's voice remained soft. "That's the curious part. The writer doesn't say. But we know who died the next day. Mr. Elwood." A silence fell. A silence weighted not with grief, but with calculation. Robert broke it. "If you're suggesting that someone in this house—" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said, "that someone once wrote a will, and someone else destroyed it, and in the space between those two acts, a man died." Outside, the wind caught a shutter and flung it against the windowpane. A sharp crack in the stillness. Inspector Alton stood. "I'll need access to all family records," he said, "and a full list of everyone present in the house the night of the fire." Neither Robert nor Camilla responded. Miss Marple only smiled slightly and turned to leave. But before she reached the door, she paused and said, quite simply, "Secrets don't mind being hidden. But lies? Lies always want to be found." Upstairs in her room, she unfolded the letter again. No signature, but the handwriting, small, careful, unsure, looked familiar. She'd seen it once, on a grocery list in the kitchen, written by the maid. Twilight hadn't yet fallen, but Hawthorne Hall already felt colder. Miss Marple sat quietly in the library, not reading, but listening, to footsteps, to silence, and to the unease of a house keeping secrets. When Edith entered with tea, Miss Marple asked softly, "You delivered the letter, didn't you?" Edith froze. I didn't mean to cause trouble. Mr. Elwood found the will. I overheard him say it changed everything." "Who did he call?" "I don't know. I only told Lady Hawthorne. I thought she'd stop it. She didn't seem surprised, just tired." "And the portrait?" "It disappeared for hours. Then it was back. I think someone took something from behind it." That night, Miss Marple returned to the drawing room alone. The portrait was gone now, burned in the fire, but its outline remained. Behind the panel in the wall, she found a hidden latch. The compartment was empty. Lady Hawthorne stood in the shadows. "Come to collect the pieces?" she asked quietly. Miss Marple stepped forward. He knew about the daughter. The one before marriage. The one kept hidden. Lady Hawthorne didn't answer. "It was never just about the will," Miss Marple said. "It was about shame. I did what I had to," Lady Hawthorne said, "to protect what was mine. And yet," Miss Marple murmured, "the family keeps breaking." Lady Hawthorne turned and walked away without a word. Miss Marple stood at the wall, eyes on the empty space. The truth, she thought, hadn't been erased. It had only been waiting. The next morning arrived with a strange quietness, the kind that presses against windows, like fog no one sees, but everyone feels. The household moved slower. Even the ticking of the hallway clock seemed more hesitant, as if measuring something other than time. Robert Hawthorne did not appear at breakfast. Miss Marple, seated near the end of the long dining table, folded her napkin carefully and rose. She made her way to the late Mr. Elwood's study, now hastily turned into Robert's office. Inside, she found it in disarray, drawers left ajar, ink smeared across the blotter, a shattered teacup on the floor. The fire had burned down to cold ash, and the room smelled faintly of burnt paper. And Robert, he stood by the fireplace, unmoving, his back stiff. "You're not here for comfort, Miss Marple," he said without turning. "I suspect you're here for the same reason my father kept that cursed letter, to dig up what should have been buried." "I'm here," Miss Marple replied softly, "because the past tends to dig itself up, with or without permission." He turned slowly. His eyes were rimmed red, but not with tears. With exhaustion. With fear. "I didn't know," he said. "Not until I found the solicitor's second envelope, the one with the seal broken." "You read it." He nodded. "A daughter. A marriage before my mother. Hidden. Erased. And if it ever came out, I wasn't supposed to inherit." Miss Marple looked at the fireplace. "You burned the will." Robert didn't deny it. "It was already unraveling," he whispered. "My name. My place in this family. My mother's pride. Elwood would have taken everything from me with a single sheet of paper. And so you took it from him. Robert flinched, the kind of movement that speaks louder than words. Miss Marple didn't press further. Not yet. She glanced at the desk. One letter sat open. It was written in a woman's hand. Older. Faded. It began simply. If anyone ever learns the truth about Margaret, it will destroy more than names. It will destroy blood. Miss Marple closed the letter gently, as though covering something fragile. She turned back toward Robert. It's not the fire that will undo you, she said. It's what remains after the flames. Then she left him standing there, in a room that still smelled faintly of smoke, and secrets that refused to die. That evening, the air in Hawthorne Hall felt heavier than usual, not with grief, but with waiting. The corridors whispered in ways they hadn't for years, and as Miss Marple wandered slowly toward the east wing, the part of the house long closed off, she noticed something peculiar. The thick layer of dust along the baseboards had been disturbed. Recently, repeatedly, a single candle guided her steps into the old drawing room. Here, the portraits of the Hawthorne lineage hung like silent judges, their varnished eyes seeming to watch. But it was the space where Sir Bernard's painting had once been, now an empty square of lighter wallpaper, that held her gaze. It wasn't simply the absence of the portrait. It was what it had hidden. The maid, her voice shaking as though afraid to even whisper what she'd seen, had told Miss Marple earlier that morning about the sketch tucked behind the burned canvas. A second portrait, smaller, done in pencil, and not of Lady Hawthorne. A woman with dark hair, the maid had said. Eyes like she knew sorrow too early. I swear, miss, I've seen that face before. Miss Marple believed her. Now, in the cold room, she turned to the nearby cabinet and opened it gently. Behind a pile of unopened letters, all addressed to Robert, was a faded frame wrapped in linen. Old dust clung to its edges. She pulled the linen back. There she was, the same woman, not in oils this time, but in pastel. Her hair was pinned loosely, the kind of style no one painted a wife in, only a muse, or a memory. Miss Marple's hand hovered near the bottom corner of the frame, where a date had once been inscribed, now nearly rubbed away. But beneath it, etched faintly, was a single initial, M. She did not need to guess. This woman, Margaret, was not just a figure from the shadows. She had been real once, loved, then locked away. And now, through fire and silence, she had returned, not to haunt, but to be acknowledged. Miss Marple left the frame untouched but uncovered, letting it face the moonlight through the thin curtain. Some portraits were never meant to be displayed, but some truths refused to remain hidden. Back in her room, as she resumed her knitting, her thoughts began to settle into a pattern. The fire, the missing will, the secret marriage, and now the face in the frame. Someone had tried to erase a life, but the portrait had remembered. The next morning, the sun shone weakly through the lace curtains of Hawthorne Hall, as if reluctant to cast light on old secrets. Miss Marple sat quietly at the breakfast table, her tea untouched, watching Robert Hawthorne through the reflection in the silver teapot. He looked tired, not in body, but in conscience. A man haunted not by loss, but by fear of what had survived the flames. Later that day, in the small study where the solicitor used to keep his files, Miss Marple asked gently, as she always did, whether she might take a look at Mr. Elwood's personal correspondence. Robert hesitated, but agreed with a wave of his hand, distracted and bitter. The files were neat, too neat, but Miss Marple knew how to read the silences between papers. Behind the third drawer, tucked where it shouldn't have been, she found it, a sealed envelope with a scorched edge, addressed not to a person, but to a place, to be opened only in the event of dispute. She opened it with slow hands. It was a letter, not written by Elwood, but by Sir Bernard himself. The ink was fading, but the intent rang clear. Should I not live to see this matter resolved, let it be known that my conscience cannot rest until the truth of Margaret's place in this family is recognized. She was my wife in all but law, and our daughter, though born in silence, is my rightful blood. The portrait was to protect her. This is not a scandal. It is justice delayed. Miss Marple folded the letter with the care one gives to confession. It explained more than anyone had dared to ask. Sir Bernard's guilt, the portrait, even the fearful silence that Lady Hawthorne had carried like a veil for decades. But what caught Miss Marple's attention most wasn't the letter's words. It was the faint scent that still clung to it. Smoke, the same lingering scent she had noticed on the forged will. This letter had survived fire, and someone had tried but failed to keep it from ever being read. Miss Marple stood in the hallway later that evening, watching the family portraits again. Her eyes drifted from Sir Bernard's painted face to the empty space beside him. The symmetry was off, not just artistically, but morally. Robert passed by and caught her gaze. For a second, he seemed about to speak. But then, like a man who feared his own voice, he turned away. Miss Marple didn't need him to say it. The past was no longer buried. It was walking the halls again, in the scent of smoke, the trace of pencil on canvas, and in the eyes of a man who suddenly doubted everything he had believed about his name. That evening, as twilight settled like dust across Hawthorne Hall, Miss Marple sat alone in the drawing room. The air was still, too still for a house that held so much memory. Somewhere deep within its walls, secrets shifted restlessly, like trapped breath waiting to escape. The letter she had found earlier rested in her lap, and in her mind, the weight of its words had not lessened. Lady Hawthorne entered without a sound, her composure perfect, her silhouette as elegant as always. But Miss Marple noticed it instantly. Her shoulders were stiffer than usual, her hands hidden tightly in the folds of her shawl. "I suppose," Lady Hawthorne began softly, "you've seen it." Miss Marple did not pretend otherwise. "Yes," she replied, "and I believe you've known it far longer than anyone else." The older woman sat down slowly. Her voice, when it came again, was not defensive, it was tired. "It was never meant to be a lie," she said. "Only a silence. A necessary one. The kind you carry for decades because the truth would collapse everything. I loved him, even knowing I wasn't the first, even knowing Margaret existed." Miss Marple's gaze remained kind, but firm. And yet, it was her name that had to vanish, her child who had to be erased. Lady Hawthorne's eyes glistened, not with tears, but with something harder, regret that had turned brittle from age. "When Elwood found the letter, I begged him to let it be. He refused. Said truth had no timetable. And so you burned it." Lady Hawthorne flinched, but only slightly. "No," she said. "I may be a coward, Miss Marple, but I'm not a murderer." There was a pause. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, and somewhere down the corridor, the floor creaked beneath invisible steps. Miss Marple's voice dropped to a whisper. "Then who did?" Lady Hawthorne looked away. "It was never me you needed to ask." She stood, adjusted her shawl, and left the room without another word. Miss Marple remained seated, her thoughts now turning swiftly to the only other person with motive, access, and something to lose. Robert. He had the name. He had the claim. And if the truth ever surfaced, he would have nothing. Miss Marple rose, the letter still in her hand. There was only one more conversation to have, and this time, the gloves would have to come off. The study was quiet when Miss Marple stepped inside, but the tension in the air had weight, like thunder holding its breath before a storm. Robert Hawthorne stood by the hearth, his back to the door, staring into the dying embers. He didn't turn when she entered. He didn't need to. "You've come to ask," he said softly. "I've come," Miss Marple replied, "because it's time." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a tired sigh, Robert reached for the decanter, poured himself a drink, and finally turned to face her. The confident air, the polished gentleman gone. In his place stood a man unraveling. "You know, don't you?" he asked. Miss Marple gave a quiet nod. Enough. Enough to understand that the fire wasn't an accident, that the letter Elwood had, the one naming Margaret's child, didn't simply vanish in the smoke. Robert looked down at the glass in his hand, then set it aside, untouched. "I found it weeks ago," he said, "hidden in the back of that cursed portrait. I knew my father's past was messy, but I didn't know that I wasn't really his only child, that I wasn't even the rightful heir." His voice broke there, and for a moment the silence said everything. "So you destroyed it," Miss Marple said quietly. He looked up, shame etched deep into every line of his face. "I didn't mean to kill Elwood," he whispered. "I just wanted the letter gone. I set the fire, yes, but I didn't know he was still in the house. He was meant to leave hours before." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, not in judgment, but in sorrow. She had suspected as much, but hearing it still made the truth heavier. "You feared losing everything," she said gently. "I feared becoming nothing," Robert answered. "The estate, the title, that's all I've ever been. Take it away, and what's left?" Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice steady, but not cold. "What's left," she said, "is whether you have the courage to face what you did." He looked at her then, really looked, and in his eyes was not defiance, but quiet devastation. "I suppose," he said slowly, "this is the part where you call the police." Miss Marple didn't reply immediately. Instead, she studied the man before her, not just the one who set the fire, but the frightened child beneath, raised on expectations and silence. "You'll need to confess," she said finally, "not because the law demands it, but because the house will never let you forget if you don't. Places like Hawthorne Hall, they remember." Robert nodded slowly, the weight of consequence settling over him like ash from a long-dead fire. As Miss Marple turned to leave, she paused at the door. "You destroyed the portrait," she said, "but you couldn't destroy the truth." Then she was gone, leaving Robert alone with his embers and the ghost of everything he tried to burn. The morning after Robert's quiet confession was colder than most, despite the spring sun brushing gold across the east windows of Hawthorne Hall. Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room once more, her knitting in hand, but her needles unmoving. The house felt different now, not louder, not quieter, simply hollow, like something inside it had finally exhaled after years of being held in. The police came later that day, not with sirens or accusations, but with quiet questions and a leather-bound notebook. Robert did not protest. He handed them the burned frame and what remained of Sir Bernard's scorched confession, and then in a low, tired voice, he told them everything. About the fire, the letter, and the fear that had consumed him long before the flames ever did. Lady Hawthorne stood at the top of the staircase as her son was led gently away. She said nothing, but her hand gripped the railing just a little too tightly, and her chin trembled once before she turned back into the shadows of the hall. Later, in the garden, Miss Marple sat with Margaret, the long-forgotten daughter, the true heir whose story had been silenced before it could even begin. She said little, this woman with eyes like Bernard's and hands like her mother's. She didn't ask for the house, or the name, or the inheritance that was now legally hers. "I only wanted the truth," Margaret said softly, "just to know that I wasn't made up." Miss Marple looked at her gently. "You weren't. You were erased. And now you've been written back in." The legal business would take time, as such things always did. Solicitors, paperwork, faded ink and legacy, all to be sorted out in stiff offices far from the aching walls of Hawthorne Hall. But the truth, at least, had been returned to its rightful place. That evening, Miss Marple stood once more before the fireplace. Above it now hung a new portrait, unfinished, modest, painted not by commission, but by the widowed daughter-in-law who had once stood in the wings and watched it all. The canvas showed the garden in spring bloom, and in the corner, nearly hidden behind roses, was a small child playing alone beneath the old oak tree. No face, just a hint, but the presence was clear. As the sun dipped below the hills, the church bell tolled 7. Not 6, not 8, just once, long and slow. A toll for the truth, at last heard, at last believed. Miss Marple rose from her seat. She folded her knitting and placed it in her basket, her fingers brushing the wool one last time. "Every mystery," she murmured, "is just a secret waiting for someone to listen kindly enough." Outside, the village began to settle into its usual rhythm, bakery shutters closing, lamplight flickering, voices hushed in the street. But in the hearts of those who had witnessed the unraveling of the story, something had shifted. A quiet understanding had taken root, like ivy on old stone. That truth, however painful, blooms better in the open. And Miss Marple, as always, walked slowly back to her cottage, her silhouette fading into the gentle dusk, knowing full well that where there are old walls and long shadows, another mystery is always waiting.